From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
Tonight, getting Trump's tax bill through Congress.
As we go into the tax negotiations or the final stages of the tax bill, we're going to see the president's campaign promises: no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent today ahead of his meeting with top Republican lawmakers on Capitol Hill on tax legislation. He just emerged saying they hope to have that portion of a massive bill done by the 4th of July. The NEC Director Kevin Hassett also saying a millionaire's tax is not on the table. That and more from the Hill when former Republican Congressman and House Financial Services Committee Chair Patrick McHenry speaks with us.
Plus, Vladimir Putin declaring a ceasefire after Secretary of State Marco Rubio meets his Russian counterpart, demanding an end to the, quote, senseless war on Ukraine. The update on the war as Trump admits he thinks Zelenskiy could cede Crimea, and the new comments from Zelenskiy as he calls for a longer ceasefire. We'll discuss the implications of that admission when Bailey Hutchison, a former U.S. ambassador to NATO, joins us.
And a raucous congressional recess.
Sir, hey, do not speak to my staff like that. If you want to leave, you can leave now.
We report on the reaction from voters after they took their grievances directly to members of Congress, the reception some lawmakers received, and how that could influence their upcoming votes.
Also tonight, Canada's referendum on Trump. We're in Ottawa as the votes come in and reveal just how much the president may have impacted the election there.
We've got our reporters covering it across all fronts tonight. Bloomberg's Enda Curran is with us on the latest in the tariff standoff. David Gura following the Canadian election, and Nick Wadhams covering that Putin-Truce agreement slated for next week.
Well, we do begin with Enda Curran joining us here on the tariff standoff, the push to get President Trump's tax cuts passed. Enda, it's good to see you as we cover both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue this evening. There was a time when the tariffs were supposed to help pay for the tax cuts. It seems that we've moved beyond that situation, even as Republican leaders from the House and Senate meet with representatives from the White House today, including the Speaker, in a sit-down with Donald Trump. Which happens first? Do we get some clarity on tariffs or a way forward on reconciliation?
Well, still a lot of noise on tariffs at the moment, Joe. The latest wrinkle today was Treasury Secretary Bessent. He spoke on CNBC and he made the point that they have been holding some talks with China. For example, that's an important confirmation. He said, however, that China has to de-escalate. First, they have to put something on the table, and he highlighted some of the exemptions that China have been putting on some goods coming from the US in terms of perhaps an indication that they want to come to the table for a deal. He did say maybe India is top of the queue to get a deal done. So he keeps talking about maybe 15 to 17 trade agreements coming down the pipes. But we don't yet have much clarity. All we know is that the administration keeps repeating the message that they are talking to key trading partners. They do expect agreements at some time soon. The scope and size and exact nature of those deals, we just don't yet know, Joe.
Yeah, Secretary Bessent, while speaking with reporters on Capitol Hill just now, said it depends on what trading partners want to do. But we know, Enda, there are trading partners that are getting priority with this administration here, specifically other countries in Asia that they would like to counter China. The problem is, are those countries going to be willing to potentially get sideways with Beijing?
Well, yeah, they're trying to do a lot all at once here. But if you take it at first base, they're trying to cut trade deals with the biggest trading partners, right? And some of those include Japan, South Korea, for example, India. Clearly, they've all been having talks, all describing those talks as going well. There's some mixed signals, but going well. But your point then, let's say they agree to those trade talks, then the administration is talking about getting a kind of an alliance together to go and tackle China and some of the trading imbalances and the kind of overcapacity story there. That's a whole other story. At the meetings last week, I heard very mixed signals on that from Asia officials. I think right here, right now, people are waiting to see, first of all, what deals are on the table and then where it goes from there.
And how quickly they can be done. Bloomberg's Enda Curran, thank you so much. Now, Canadians are heading to the polls to elect a new government in a race that's become neck and neck. The Liberal Party, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, up narrowly over the Conservatives, which had been considered the favourites to win back control before President Trump's tariff standoff and rhetoric about making Canada the 51st state upended the race. One poll finding only 11% of Canadians had a positive impression of President Trump heading into the election. And joining us now live from Ottawa is Bloomberg's David Gura. So, David, add in the Trump factor, and this thing seems like it's a bit of a toss-up, though the Liberals have a stronger chance than they did just months ago.
And that's the really astonishing thing here. When you look back just a couple of months, you had the Conservatives with an overwhelming lead over the Liberals. Then Justin Trudeau retired from politics, and we had Mark Carney join that Liberal leadership race, win it. And we saw Liberals really not just make up that ground, but advance beyond it. So even looking at the most recent polling here, Liberals still have an edge. It'll be interesting to see sort of how all of that plays out here as the night goes on. But the role of Donald Trump in this conversation, in this campaign, can't be underestimated. He has infused himself into it over and over again, as most recently as this morning when he put a post on Truth Social weighing in on the race. And then we had Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, chiming in, telling Donald Trump to stay out of the race. This is something that's going to be determined by Canadian voters themselves. But he's threatened Canada in two ways. Of course, the first has to do with the trade relationship, the longstanding economic relationship between these two countries. But then there's the constant references to making Canada the 51st state, this threat on sovereignty. And if you look at what the Liberal leader has said in recent weeks, over and over again, he said he's taken Donald Trump seriously whenever he says that. It's not a joke to him. It never has been a joke. So we're waiting for the polls to close, and we'll get some sense of how this election is going in just a few hours. The bulk of the seats in Parliament are held in Ontario and Quebec, and we'll see then sort of some indication of how this is all going. And of course, just to give you a sense of the level of enthusiasm and engagement that voters have had in this process, there were a few days of early voting here in Canada. A record 7 million Canadians voted in that early stage of voting here in this race. So it's something that not everyone's just not even watching closely. They're participating in, very animated in, of course. And Donald Trump's comments are just adding further fuel to that level of interest here in the outcome of this race.
David, thank you so much. Bloomberg's David Gura will touch base with you a bit later on this hour for a bit more. Vladimir Putin today announcing a 3-day truce with Ukraine, time to coincide with Russia's Victory Day anniversary, just as Donald Trump said he believes Zelenskiy is ready to give up Crimea, a prerequisite for peace, according to Russia. This afternoon, in a post on X, Zelenskiy stating that a ceasefire between the two must be for at least 30 days. And for a look at that meeting between President Trump, Ukrainian President Zelenskiy over the weekend, and the temporary truce proposal, we bring in Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, who runs our national security team here in Washington. Nick, we're going to look back for years at the image of these two world leaders sitting knee to knee on simple chairs inside the Vatican over the weekend. Will we look back on that as a turning point in negotiations?
Well, Ukraine certainly thinks so. I mean, the imagery there was just extraordinary. When you compare that to the shouting match that broke out in the Oval Office several weeks ago, to see that sort of intimate, as you say, knee-to-knee conversation on these chairs in the middle of the Vatican, I mean, this is really where Volodymyr Zelensky wants to be. It seems like President Trump has shifted now to his side, and so perhaps it's then no coincidence that you have Vladimir Putin saying, hey, let's do a 3-day truce, which I think to a lot of people suggests a testing the waters to see if he can lure President Trump back to the Russian side to say, okay, hey, look, Russia's the good faith actor here, so we're just going to have to see how that shakes out.
But in the meantime, Nick, you also had the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, on the Sunday shows over the weekend suggesting that this week is critical. This is the week the U.S. decides whether or not it wants to continue to engage in this effort at all. Why this week? And is that really true?
I think what you're seeing there, I mean, as we know, President Trump himself has long said, next week we're going to do something within a week or within 2 weeks. So it's tough to take that at face value. But I think the administration is really trying to put pressure. I think in part they're worried that President Trump is going to lose interest in this conversation, but also I think it reflects a growing frustration that they are not seeing it from the Russian side, at least, a sense that he really wants to play ball. That 3-day truce idea, I mean, as you've seen, we've spoken with folks in the administration who say, we want a ceasefire. We want a ceasefire, an unconditional ceasefire. Stop. We don't want just 72 hours. This has to be a longer-term thing. So there is a rising frustration there. A lot of folks initially had read those Rubio comments that may be being more directed toward Ukraine, but I think there's a feeling now that he's really starting to feel a sense of frustration that Russia is just not willing to make the concessions that are going to be needed to bring this thing home.
All right, Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams leading our national security team here in Washington. Thank you so much. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says we could see a trade deal as early as this week. We'll discuss the negotiations and where they stand coming up with Nazak Nikakhtar, former Undersecretary at the Department of Commerce, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think it could be as early as this week or next week. Vice President Vance was in India last week, and negotiations are coming along quite well with them. As I've mentioned, some of our Asian trading partners have come with very, very good deals. We're evaluating those.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent this morning providing an update on tariff negotiations with top trading partners. He also said that the U.S. is in contact with China, but that it's up to Beijing to de-escalate the trade standoff. President Trump, meantime, standing by his tariff policy in an interview published today in The Atlantic. The president telling the publication the potential for financial turmoil caused by tariffs, quote, always affects you a little bit, but there's no red line, no certain number at which he would feel compelled to change course. Joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Nazak Nikakhtar, former Undersecretary at the Department of Commerce and now partner at Wiley Rein. Nazak, great to have you back on Balance of Power. As we consider this suggestion from Scott Bessent that we may see a deal of some kind coming in relatively short order, how robust do you actually anticipate that deal will be given the short duration of negotiations?
Yeah, absolutely, and great to be with you. There's no reason why none of these why all of these negotiations can't proceed very expeditiously. The U.S., we've had trading relationships with these partners for years, for decades, and every single year, the U.S. government, the U.S. Trade Representative, puts together a list of market access distortions, tariff, non-tariff barriers, et cetera, with respect to each and every single country. So the U.S. is very clear-eyed in what kinds of deals it seeks from each of these countries. The real question is which of these countries and how many of them are going to agree to what the U.S. wants. But if we're on the same page, and again, I really want to underscore, the U.S. has been studying these problems for years and has logged all of the issues it has. If our trading partners agree to the issues we have, there's no reason we can't get these deals done very, very quickly.
We got a bit of an update from the White House press secretary earlier today. It was actually pretty early in the morning for a briefing. Caroline Leavitt sharing how the administration's push to get these trade deals done is progressing. Here's what she said.
We're working around the clock. The trade team is working all day. I was on the phone late last night with Secretary Lutnick. I was on the phone this weekend as well with Secretary Bessent. I mean, the entire team is working 24/7 to get these trade deals done. And I think you'll be hearing more about them this week. I don't want to get ahead of the trade team or the president in announcing potential deals, but certainly I can assure the American public that this administration is full speed ahead.
I don't know if we're talking actual deals or framework agreements here, Nazak, but even in the world of a full-on trade deal, let's say announced with Japan or South Korea, who we're in talks with, Bloomberg News is reporting that public sentiment in China is very much on the side of President Xi. We did a number of interviews, dozens of them, with stakeholders across business and government on different levels. Financial investors, manufacturers, policymakers seem to be motivated by what Donald Trump is doing here to fight back against the U.S. Is that a recipe for concessions?
You know, that's really hard to say, but we've got to remember that the Chinese government, they can tightly control the information that's disseminated in China. So to me, it's not surprising that the Chinese government, that the Chinese people are kind of corralling against the narrative that their government has put out, because that's really all they know. And their access to sort of broad, unbiased information just really isn't available. So the Chinese government has sort of structured this in a way that public support is really geared towards what the Chinese government, what the Chinese Communist Party thinks. But I do also want to add that the Chinese government seems to have flinched they just reduced or announced a reduction, even though they've sort of backtracked it and denied it in some respects. But in large part, it's really understood that they're easing some of their export restrictions on U.S. products, including certain semiconductors. So look, despite what the kind of hype and the narrative that the Chinese government wants to put out there, they're starting to demonstrate some willingness to concede to enter a deal with the United States. So the President Trump knows the kind of structural reforms that he needs in China to open up access to for U.S. exporters and to get a level playing field. And from the latest information over the last few days, we know that despite the narrative, again, that President Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party is putting out in China, they are bending to some of the U.S.'s demands. So we'll see how it goes.
But even if they do bend and some kind of agreement can be reached to lower the extraordinary high levels of tariffs we've placed on each other now, Nazak, how quickly can trade volumes between the U.S. and China actually come back? Goods get loaded up once again on container freights and shipped to the port of Long Beach. Can it just restart automatically?
In many ways it can, and in many ways it can't, right? Structurally, how quickly we can do these deals, just even on paper, we're not going to do broad, all-encompassing deals that you have to go through every sector, right? These are going to be sort of narrow deals that deal with very specific problems, but those problems can impact a wide range of sectors, which then goes to the key point you're going after is, do we get to just put things back on the ships and ship them to the United States? I will tell you, U.S. industry is banking on some kind of deals across the board. They're just holding their breath, not saying necessarily this is going to be the new way, but they're saying, okay, how long do I have to deal with this until I can get my goods back on a ship and export it to the United States? So from everything I see and hear and the discussions I have with industry, they are ready to go to put their goods on the ship. They're just waiting for the word from the administration.
Nazak, it's good to have you back. Nazak Nikakhtar, former Undersecretary, Department of Commerce, now partner at Wiley Rein. Thank you for the insights. A 3-day truce proposed by Russia. But Ukrainian President Zelenskiy is calling for a longer timeline now, and we'll discuss the state of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine with Bailey Hutchison, former U.S. ambassador to NATO. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
He told me that he needs more weapons, but he's been saying that for 3 years, He needs more weapons, and we're going to see what happens. I want to see what happens with respect to Russia, because Russia had been surprised and disappointed, very disappointed that they did the bombing of those places after discussion.
President Trump yesterday revealing a few details of his 15-minute-long conversation with Ukrainian President Zelenskiy. It happened Saturday, just before Pope Francis's funeral. You can see an image of that meeting if you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube. Following their huddle there, knee to knee, Zelenskiy tweeted he's hopeful for a reliable and lasting peace, and in fact called for a longer ceasefire than Russia is now proposing. Joining us for more is Bailey Hutchison, former U.S. ambassador to NATO. Ambassador, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to see you. Vladimir Zelenskiy says he wants 30 days. There are some who are concerned, though, that Russia would simply use that time to regroup. What do you think?
I think it is in everyone's interest to have as long a ceasefire as possible so that real negotiations can go on for a final result. That would be my instinct. Whatever they can agree to that would be a real ceasefire would be helpful because, of course, the last time they had an agreement, Russia broke the agreement. So it's important that now that America is very engaged in the negotiation, that Russia keep its word if they give it.
I guess it's a question, Ambassador, of how long the U.S. will remain engaged in negotiation, because the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, once again over the weekend suggested if progress isn't made this week, the U.S. may have to reconsider its involvement here. Does that just give Vladimir Putin incentive to wait out the Trump administration?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think that the president is engaged in this now and does not want to fail. And I think that whatever we could get in the way of a ceasefire where there could be real negotiations, I think the president would stick with it. I do. I think he wants this to happen. Clearly, he has said he wants the killing to stop. And every time we think there's a pause, then Russia within a week has hit a civilian complex that killed 11 people. So it's very difficult to negotiate in that kind of atmosphere.
It certainly is. And as President Trump last week called for higher level talks, direct talks between Russia and Ukraine, I wonder how you see that going were it to happen. Obviously, Volodymyr Zelenskiy wants to get underway here, but if Vladimir Putin continues to target civilians, should the U.S. treat him as a serious actor at the negotiating table?
Well, I think that's a question that President Trump himself has raised. He was very disappointed that after the talks had begun, and there were even meetings in Europe, that Vladimir Putin would then go forward and kill civilians. And he said that. And clearly he has talked to Putin again. And after the talk that seemed to have a positive outcome at the Pope's funeral, I think there was a renewed hope. And everyone that I've talked to, certainly my former Senate colleagues, my former ambassador colleagues, have said that we need to have a ceasefire in order to have the beginnings of talk about what would be a lasting peace. And a lasting peace is what the West wants, and we are not sure about what Putin wants.
We just have a minute left here, Ambassador, but if ultimately at the end of this, the U.S. recognizes Crimea as Russian and Russia's illegal annexation of that territory turns out to be something that is formalized, what would that mean for other NATO allies who are considering whether Russia would ever cast its eye toward their borders?
I wouldn't want to comment on any one point in a peace agreement, because if there is an agreement, say Ukraine had to give up something, then they should get something in return for that. For instance, if there are parts of the Donbass that Russia seeks to have as a land bridge to Crimea, and that is a part of a negotiation, I think that perhaps not giving a land bridge or perhaps assuring the safety of Ukraine ships on the Black Sea. It's going to be very important for Ukraine's economy to have the shipping rights in the Black Sea. So there will be give and take. I don't want to say one thing that would maybe be on the table. It has to be a give and take. For there to be
Ambassador, we have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us. Bailey Hutchison, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, right here on Bloomberg.
Sir, hey, do not speak to my staff like that. If you want to leave, you can leave now. Everybody show everybody a little bit of respect here, please. Okay?
Republican Congressman Mike Lawler hosting a town hall that turned rowdy over the weekend as constituents expressed their anger over President Trump and the majority in Congress. The meeting was one of few in-person forums held by Republicans during lawmakers' 2-week break after similar scenes played out across the country during the last few months. And joining us now with the details is Bloomberg congressional reporter Billy House, who attended Lawler's event and is here with us now on Bloomberg TV and radio. So, Billy, obviously Lawler is not the first to face this kind of reception, try to have to do what he can in reaction to the crowd. But what does this exemplify in terms of how the American electorate is feeling about Congress and Congress's lack of interest, perhaps, in providing a check to this Trump administration, at least right now?
Well, that really was the theme of this. It really was a circus-like town hall. I mean, Lawler wasn't able to even finish any answers hardly without being booed, jeered. He tried to explain tariffs, and the crowd, this section of the crowd in unison, chanted blah blah blah. Even the announcement of the national anthem drew some boos. So it was a odd forum, especially for a guy like Mike Lawler, an erudite guy who tries to explain intricate details, and people don't have time or interest in listening to him, especially at a town hall.
Well, the disruptions actually started before the congressman ever got on stage. Billy, there are a lot of questions about who's showing up for these town halls, and some Republicans have suggested they're so-called Democratic actors. Can you tell us who is actually in the room?
There are a lot of Democrats, but there were a lot of quiet Republicans, and that was there were people there supportive of Lawler, but they weren't noisy. And so that kind of skewed the view of what was going on. Listen, people signed up because of public postings, and who signed up and got tickets, about 700 of them. There was no picking of who was going to show up or not picking. And then the questions were randomly selected in like a bingo spinner.
Yeah,
so there was nothing skewed anyway. It's just that people who are active in politics are emotional sometimes, and more of them were more emotional than the quiet Republicans who showed up.
That's for sure. Well, I love the fact that you were actually there. Bloomberg's Billy House with a first-hand report. Thank you, as ever, here on Bloomberg. As we consider now the process and the effort to extend the 2017 Trump tax cuts, we spoke on the early edition of Balance of Power with Republican Congressman Bill Huizenga of Michigan, sits on the Financial Services Committee and is now in the throes of this debate. He shared the timeline for reconciliation this week. Listen.
The reconciliation, the quote unquote one big beautiful bill is a significant thing. I had a chance to talk to the president this morning briefly, where we talked a little bit about what's happening. My Financial Services Committee is going to be marking up on Wednesday. Ed and Labor is doing tomorrow, and a few others are doing tomorrow. The big ones are going to be both in Ways and Means and Energy and Commerce. And so there's progress that's being made on those.
Joining us now with his perspective, Patrick McHenry, the former Republican congressman from North Carolina, former chair of the House Financial Services Committee. Mr. Chairman, good to see you. Welcome back. I wonder your thoughts now that lawmakers are coming back to town. We're all excited to see each other again, and it's kind of a renewed effort to get the ball rolling on this. We saw important meetings today at the White House and on Capitol Hill with leadership and with the administration. Scott Bessent just suggested, though, coming out of a meeting on Capitol Hill, that this Memorial Day timeline may not be all that realistic. What's the real scoop from someone who's actually held the gavel?
Well, the month of May will be what dictates the health of the whole summer. What House Republicans, Senate Republicans can get to the president's desk will happen in the next 90 days. Without having a substantive and action-filled May, you're not going to get a tax bill or a digital asset bill to the president's desk by June or July. So without actually getting it done correctly and well here and ironing out all the details, you're not going to get the reconciliation bill done. If you let the next 2 or 3 weeks go by, then you're looking at the fall before these major packages can reach the president's desk. And that's not conforming with the administration's expectations. It's certainly not what the president has said he wants.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so when we consider these markups starting this week, having led a committee yourself, Mr. Chairman, which committee head do you envy the least here? Who is going to have the toughest job trying to reconcile tax cuts and finding requisite spending cuts?
Everyone has a tough job. Look, Jason Smith, chair of the Ways and Means Committee, has a big task, but he has built up huge political capital to put this tax bill together. Brett Guthrie is the chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee. He has built up political capital to go execute on the president's campaign pledges. and commitments he's made to the American people. So I think they've got the toughest road policy-wise to actually perform. But they're really capable leaders, and I have high expectations for their capacity to get these things done.
Well, we're looking for an X date as soon as this week. And I want to ask you about your thoughts on this, because there is a belief that it'll land a bit earlier than some had thought. Maybe we're talking about an X date in June. Congressman, if that happens, it's going to change the dynamic and change the debate. And I'm assuming will force leadership to deal with the debt limit on a standalone basis here and actually have to work with Democrats. If that's the case, can they get that done with the other party? And how does that impact the debate around tax cuts?
Well, look, to quote Red from Shawshank Redemption, get busy living or get busy dying. Right. Wow. So you better have you better have this thing planned out hour by hour between now and the 4th of July recess. That is really what you have to expect that Congress has to get this tax bill done by. If it slips past July 4th, then the August recess is the backstop. So you really have 3 weeks in May to actually get the committee work done, and then you've got the whole month of June to actually get this across the House and Senate floor. That's what it looks like to me. That means that each week that goes by, the grind gets harder, the expectations get higher. And in order to get certainty in the market on taxes, especially, and where we are in terms of our debt and deficits, this is really what the whole president's 4 years will be defined by, is what happens this summer on taxes, on regulatory issues making its way through the House and Senate, and finally with tariffs. There's a lot at stake in this summer of 2025.
Yeah, considering it's a July deadline when this 90-day window, the relief from the higher reciprocal tariff rates will expire. And on that subject, Mr. Chairman, President Trump yesterday reaffirmed that he believes tariffs will be enough to allow for further tax cuts. This is what he said. We'll have you respond.
We're taking in a lot of money from tariffs. We were losing a lot before I got here. We were losing billions of dollars a day, and now we're doing great, and we haven't even kicked in yet. And eventually we'll be reducing taxes very substantially for the people of our country, because the money is so great coming in from tariffs that I'll be able to reduce taxes to a very large extent, and maybe almost completely.
Maybe almost completely is what he said, Mr. Chairman. And I just wonder how realistic you think that is mathematically.
Look, I'm a Republican who believes that we should have tax cuts for any reason. So I've never seen a tax cut I didn't like or didn't vote for. And so you also have to have, in this environment, though, the necessary spending cuts so that you don't worsen our national debt. The Treasuries market will speak. The bond market will speak if Congress doesn't get this right. And we actually need to have a really firm grasp on the spending cut side of this thing in order for this package to have the full necessary positive economic impact that the president desires. What the president's talking about with tariffs, though, is an assumption that the tariff rate will not go down to zero. There's a lot of wish casting among many in the market that the president really desires a tariff-free world, when he's never said that. And that is like I said, it's a wish casting rather than looking at the policy of this president. And so I think tariffs will be a part of the revenue game in Washington in the years to come in a way that's it's going to be tricky and going to rebalance international trade in significant ways.
We started this whole conversation with a look inside Congressman Mike Lawler's town hall meeting that went a bit off the rails, and a lot of them have been recently. Patrick McHenry, you're not in Congress anymore, so you don't have to endure this stuff. But I wonder what you're hearing from your former colleagues. Just to wrap this up here, is there some buyer's remorse when it comes to Donald Trump? We're supposed to be talking about animal spirits now, not guys like you getting screamed at by constituents. What's the conversation behind closed doors?
Well, look, if you look at a guy like Mike Lawler, he wants to go back to his constituents and say, I'm not scared. I'm not scared of you. You're my bosses at home. I'm going to answer to you. And if some people want to shout and yell, that's fine. You can do that to me. But you shouldn't do this to my staff members or to volunteers that are making these town halls happen. The other element of this is a guy like Mike Lawler showing up to show what the opposition looks like, how nasty they can be, how they refuse to listen to reasonable explanations of what's happening. And so the combination of those two things of being brave enough to go back to your bosses and talk to them, I always did and always appreciated. I appreciated doing the discipline of doing town halls. I also appreciated more so having done the town hall and being done with them. And so I don't envy my colleagues having to answer these tough questions, and I'm grateful to be on the outside and not have to do them. It's a tough environment, and in the economic performance is to come for this administration and Republican leadership in Washington. It's not yet here, though.
All right, may not have to answer questions from constituents anymore, but thank you for answering our questions. Patrick McHenry, former Republican congressman from North Carolina, former chair of the Financial Services Committee. Thank you so much. And we'll continue the conversation on Republican lawmakers' priorities now that Congress is back in town with our political panel. Next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We're going to be having a tax meeting today, but what you can see is that as we go into the tax negotiations of the final stages of the tax bill, we're going to see the president's campaign promises: no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent teasing a meeting of the so-called Big Six, Republican congressional leaders and members of the administration, that was held this afternoon on Capitol Hill to discuss tax bill negotiations. The goal is to pass legislation that includes a renewal of Trump's first-term cuts and a fresh round of other reductions, partially paid for by curbing federal spending. Bessent told reporters after the meeting he hopes the tax portion can be done by the 4th of July. And joining us now for more is this evening's political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. So, Rick, coming into today, the Speaker of the House was still suggesting Memorial Day was his deadline. The Treasury Secretary suggests actually, no, it's the next big summer holiday. Is it just Bessent being realistic here?
I think everybody's, doing a different game of expectation setting based on the constituencies they have. Bessent wants to make sure that when he sets a bar on a date, it's something he can deliver to Donald Trump. What Speaker Johnson's doing is trying to corral a bunch of I would say, grumpy House members who are all trying to figure out how do they agree to a bill like this. It's going to be an expansive spending bill, especially if you add all those extra tax breaks that the Secretary of Treasury was talking about, and then pay for it, with a $1.5 to $2 trillion cuts. That's going to be a lot harder to do, and I think from everybody I've talked to on the Hill, impossible to do by Labor Day.
Well, you know what this means here, Jeannie? If we wait for the tax portion by July 4th, we could have to deal with the debt ceiling before then. Republicans can manage the timeline around this to the extent that they want to, but that would force Republican leadership to have to work with Democrats, to actually have to make a bargain. This is looking more likely as we get closer to learning the real X date here. Is Hakeem Jeffries ready for that? What will Democrats get for it?
Yeah, I think Democrats are under enormous pressure from their own base. So while they do want to get things out of that if they can, they also are under pressure just to sit back, pull up the popcorn, and watch the fireworks go. Because the Republicans have set themselves out for a really almost impossible task. And you were just talking about Mike Lawler, right here in my backyard. We've had congressmen, Republicans and Democrats, home for 2 weeks now. They are coming back and they are understanding in a way they didn't before that people are in a really sour mood about the economy. So it makes it all that much more difficult for Republicans to thread this needle that they've set out for themselves. So whether it's the debt ceiling, whether it's the pay-fors that Rick was talking about, how to bring together these groups of Republicans who are so divergent on so many issues and who are really dug in terms of what they want to see, whether it's no cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, whether it's the SALT cap, whether it's the insistent that they address the deficit, whether it's those people who don't want to claw back on the IRA. There are so many different groups. I just think it's going to be a very fascinating but difficult few days or few months, rather, for Republican leadership to try to pull these folks together. And Democrats don't really have much of a role in this at all.
Well, and when we consider these negotiations are happening against the backdrop of the week in which Donald Trump will reach the 100-day mark of his administration, Rick, going to celebrate it with a rally in Michigan tomorrow, kind of campaign style, if you will. Does he risk making more promises tomorrow that he can't necessarily rely on Congress to keep for him?
Yeah, that would always be a problem with Donald Trump. He gets in front of the stage and goes off script. But I think his narrative is going to be, look at what I accomplished in my first 100 days, right? That's enough to really jam into a 2-hour speech if he wants to make it. There's been a lot done. Polling indicates that that maybe not everybody's particularly happy about it, but he doesn't lack for activity. And so I can't imagine a scenario where he isn't already knee-deep into that speech before he tries to, whip up some new policies, at least not ones that cost money right now. I think that the biggest concern House Republicans have, and they've got the pen on this, is deficit reduction. They've got to be able to show, if they expect to get reelected, some movement on the deficits. And all this free spending that the administration's talking about is making them increasingly nervous.
Jeannie, we've only got about 30 seconds here. Democrats are about to ramp up the instant reaction machine. They're going to have the war room going tomorrow and try to get Democrats placed on programs to talk about the first 100 days. Is that time well spent, or should Democrats just keep their hands off the wheel and let the polls speak for themselves?
I'm of the opinion, and there's a lot of disagreement on this, that they should just sit back and wait. Donald Trump has done a lot, to Rick's point, but the problem for Trump is that it's wildly unpopular. And I keep just imagining the counterfactual. What if Trump had come in 100 days ago and not done much at all, just sort of steered the ship? We'd probably be in a position where his poll numbers were as high as they were in January.
Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano with a great conversation. Thank you so much for a great panel. Coming up, Election Day, as we've told you, in Canada is coming to a close. We'll check in with Bloomberg's David Gura live in Ottawa before the results start to roll in. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kaylee Lyons. I'm Joe Matthew. We thank you for being with us. Nearly 29 million Canadians are voting today to elect new leadership. We want to check back in with Bloomberg's David Gura, who is there, joining us live from Ottawa on Canada's Election Day. David, polls closing between 7 and 10 p.m. Eastern Time. How's this all going to work?
Well, we're going to begin to see those results from the provinces near where I'm standing in short order. So around 8 or 9 o'clock, we're going to start getting some numbers. And this, of course, is where most of the seats in Parliament are clustered. So we could get some indication, depending on how they come out, of where this is going to be going. And then what we're going to see, if there isn't an outright majority, of course, there could be a federal minority government that could work with other parties to pass certain legislation. We'll see if any of that has to happen, if that's going to come together. But all indications are from folks who covered the politics here closely, that we should get some indication of the outcome here a little later this evening.
Well, and just remind us, David, of what really is going to drive that outcome. Is it more domestic issues in Canada or the impact of President Trump?
It was for such a long time just about domestic issues principally, but then we had the infusion of Donald Trump into this race, and he has spoken a lot about the economic relationship, of course, the trading relationship between these two countries, but about Canada's sovereignty as well. And that's been a really galvanizing force here, getting folks to the polls today, getting folks to vote early, that extraordinary turnout that we saw. A record 7 million people voted here during early voting in the days leading up to this election today. So, yes, it still has to do with the fact there's a dearth of housing in this country that's affordable, still has to do with concerns about growth in this country, about inflation, about the debt and deficits, but it really has to do more now with trade and that trading relationship and what Donald Trump has said over and over again as recently as this morning. That's something that's really been sort of, again, a galvanizing force here, getting people to the polls and taking real interest in this election today.
All right, Bloomberg's David Gura live in Ottawa for that election. Thank you so much. And speaking of President Trump, as he hits his 100 days in office this week, we're going to bring you here on Balance of Power analysis of his second term. On Tuesday, our program will extend for Trump's speech from Warren, Michigan, in the state's auto workers' heartland.
And on Wednesday, we examine the impact of the president's major decisions on markets and the economy. We've got a lot prepared for you on Balance of Power. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.